Konnichiwa, this is the Shogunstein. Let's go back in time a little bit. 1994, I'm living in a house in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and it's a college house with a bunch of students at prestigious Mary Washington College. And it's the summer, and we're in kind of a little bit of a sketchy neighborhood. There's a questionable house across the street from us with maybe some questionable activities going on. And that summer, we got a mysterious temporary roommate for a couple months. He claimed to be an architect, but he didn't really seem to know much about architecture. And we really didn't know what his deal was. He was a little older than the rest of us. But I remember one evening, he treated us all to the movies. We went to the movie theater, 1994, and saw the Steven Seagal film On Deadly Ground, which I was very excited to see because prior to that, Steven Seagal had been in some of my favorite action films of the late 80s, early 90s, including, of course, Above the Law, Hard to Kill, one of my favorites, Marked for Death, and then sort of the pinnacle of his movies, Under Siege. So coming off those great films, we went to see On Deadly Ground, which had a great cast. It had Arlie Ermy in it. It had Michael Caine, had Billy Bob Thornton, and it was a strange and had some good fights, but man, pretty bad movie with an ending, a very weird speech from Steven Seagal on the environment. But I just never forget the circumstances of that film with the guy who was probably some sort of undercover DEA or police officer checking out what was going on across the street. And just how weird that movie, just the whole thing was weird. The weird roommate and the just weird film. And that film kind of marked the beginning of the end, at least for me, of loving Steven Seagal films. He was my favorite of these actors in the late 80s, 90s action films. So this is a book review of a new book that just came out about many of these movies and just about all the movies discussed in this book. And it's their stars I had seen either in the theaters or on VHS. The book is called The Last Action Heroes, The Triumphs, Flops, and Feuds of Hollywood's Kings of Carnage by Nicholas Semlyen. So this is a review of the book. And again, the subject is basically 80s into the early 90s action heroes. And if you can tell from the cover, these are people whose movies, I pretty much saw all of them in the 80s and 90s. So, of course, in the center here, you got Arnold Schwarzenegger, you got Stallone, you got Jackie Chan, Dolph Lundgren, Steven Seagal, Bruce Willis, the Muscles from Brussels, Jean-Claude Van Damme, and, of course, Chuck Norris. So this book does a great job just chronicling the films and the film careers of these action stars in the 80s and 90s. And they focus, they discuss a number of films, but in particular, obviously with Bruce Willis, Die Hard, Jean-Claude Van Damme, Bloodsport, for Schwarzenegger, the Terminator movies, and Conan, Steven Seagal. Seagal, that's probably, again, he was, of these action heroes, he was my favorite at the time. I mean, I really still remember watching Above the Law for the first time and just being amazed, especially at the end when he breaks that guy's back backwards. Seagal's story is interesting in the book. Dolph Lundgren, obviously, talking about Rocky IV and Universal Soldier. Stallone with the making of Rocky. Chuck Norris with the missing in action films. And the Jackie Chan stuff was interesting, too, because I really didn't know much about his first attempt to come to America with Battle Creek Brawl, which was the same director as Enter the Dragon. I remember him from the Cannonball Run movies. I used to enjoy them as a kid. But I do remember The Protector, which was a failed film of his, but it led to him going back to Hong Kong and doing the police story movies, which were really a big hit for him back in Hong Kong. And then even when he did finally make it big in America, it wasn't for an American film, what they try to do with Battle Creek Brawl and The Protector, but it was actually one of those police story movies, in that case Rumble in the Bronx, which they just basically dubbed, but it was, one of his Hong Kong films, and they just released it here as opposed to, trying to make him into Clint Eastwood, which is what they try to do in the Protector. So the book was a lot of fun. This was one of the fastest reads that I have done in a while because, again, I had seen all of these movies, and these are some of my favorite movies of all time. So some of the stuff about Stallone kind of knew, the struggles to make Rocky, but I also enjoyed some of the stuff here about, movies like Demolition Man or some of the other films that he had done. So that was good. Dolph Lundgren was interesting because, there was some stuff about him I didn't know. I didn't realize that he could have been much bigger after the Rocky films. It was interesting to see, how his career went. Then we had the other hit with Universal Soldier, but he kind of went right to, VHS and then DVD. But he did have that film with Brandon Lee and Tia Carrere, which was pretty good. Obviously, Bruce Willis, and I just kind of forgot about how his character in Die Hard was more of an everyday kind of man versus some of the indestructible characters the others had played. And then with Van Damme, it was interesting to read some of the stuff about Predator and his failed attempt to be the first Predator monster, and how he kind of broke in at Cannon Films. And of course, Chuck Norris is just Chuck Norris, legendary. And here we got the picture here from Invasion USA, great film. So this was a really interesting book. And again, these were stories about all these films that I saw, again, in the theater, or, again, going back to, Blockbuster or Hollywood Video when they went right to video. So great book, really interesting stories about them and the rivalries and, just the showmanship. And it was just a very entertaining read about behind the scenes stuff about some of my favorite actors and favorite movies. So as much as I loved the book, though, there were a couple things I would have liked to have seen in the book a little more. One, it took Bruce Willis a little longer for this, and unfortunately, he has some sort of dementia now or some sort of version of Alzheimer's. But with him, it didn't happen until fairly recently. Schwarzenegger, it never really happened to. Chuck Norris kind of retired from films. He had Walker, Texas Ranger, so it didn't really affect him. Jackie Chan, obviously, his bigger career is over in China and Hong Kong and Asia. But with Stallone, with, again, Dolph Lundgren, and Lundgren kind of first, Van Damme, and certainly Seagal, I would have liked more about how suddenly it seemed like out of the blue, one day they're doing big films that I remember seeing in the movies, and the next thing they're going right to VHS or straight to DVD. Again, the last few years, you had Bruce Willis making these, kind of terrible right to Hulu, right to Amazon Prime movies, but that didn't really happen until recently. And again, with Schwarzenegger, he took time off to be the Governor, and then he came back with Last Stand, which I think is a fantastic movie. In fact, we just rewatched that the other day. It's a fantastic comeback movie. So with those two, it didn't really happen. But with Stallone, there were a couple movies that went right to DVD. Dolph Lundgren, pretty much all his movies, with the exception of those Universal Soldier movies, went to DVD. Seagal, again, when you read his story in here and just some of the craziness around him and just how he, allegedly treated people, maybe that's part of it. But it seemed like, 1 minute he's doing Under Siege 2, that movie with DMX, I think it was Exit Wounds. But they were doing these big movies. They were, movies that I remember seeing in the movies. And then suddenly, I remember with Seagal, it was like one where it had something to do with like a disease, like some sort of outbreak, and he worked, you know, uh, he was, I don't know if he was working for the CDC or something like that. But that was the first one I remember going right to DVD, and there was no turning back. Again, even Stallone had some that went right to DVD. Obviously, again, Chuck Norris with Walker, Texas Ranger, he went right to television, and then, of course, all the great books. But it's, again, same thing with Van Damme. I remember, every October, it seemed like in October, he'd have like a big movie in the theaters. And I remember, through the early 90s, going to the theaters to see, a Van Damme movie. And again, his pinnacle kind of Time Cop, or another good one was, I forget the name of the one, was in the hockey arena. But those were great films. And again, same thing. He's, to this day, most of his films go right to DVD. So I would have liked to have seen more in the book as to why it just really seemed like with one picture, a bunch of these guys went right to, straight to video, straight to DVD. I would have liked a little more about that. And again, Schwarzenegger had a couple films that didn't do as well. There was that one with Robert Duvall. There was, of course, Last Action Hero, which is actually not a bad movie at all. But it was, people didn't really kind of understand. People kind of misunderstood that film because it was really kind of a satire of action movies. But I remember Stallone, he had some, I remember it was one where he was like a cop and they're in like the Arctic somewhere and they're in like some sort of like rehab place. And then there was a remake he had done of another film and they even went right to DVD. Sort of like to have known, how do you go from big movies like, Executive Decision and, Under Siege 1 and 2 right to video. Now, again, the book didn't go into Wesley Snipes very much, but he's another actor too. One minute he's doing Blade, next minute he's going right to DVD. I would have liked that aspect of it. The other thing I would have liked a little more about, and again, this kind of ties in more with Van Damme and Chuck Norris. They worked for Golan Globus, those Cannon films. I guess maybe that could be a whole nother subject, but I would have liked a little more about that. And, Cannon and Golan Globus had done a bunch of other action films, again, with Charles Bronson. The book didn't, obviously Charles Bronson was a bigger star before the 80s. But, he was part of that time period, too, where he was doing all of those Death Wish sequels and a lot of those Cannon films. So I would have liked a little more about the Cannon films, Michael Dudikoff, the American Ninja films, and one of my favorite actors who was a sidekick for Chuck Norris in several films, Steve James. Steve James, I think, is the unsung hero of a lot of these 80s action films. He was in Delta Force, the hero in the Terror. He was in the American Ninja films. And he was even in a POW, The Escape, which as a kid was one of my favorite movies. I liked it even more than the Rambo or the Missing in Action films. And that actually had David Carradine. But that was a Golan Globus film, too. So I would have liked some more in the canon. And again, Steve James, who died way too young, I believe was of some sort of form of liver cancer. But he was a terrific, actor who was in a number of these 80s action films. But that's just me nitpicking because I really enjoyed this book. I read it really fast. And again, these are some of my favorite films. I can't tell you what an impact it made. I remember I didn't know who Steven Seagal was. And I remember some friends saying, we're going to go see this movie Above the Law. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I walked away from that movie like, holy cow, that was one of the greatest action films I'd ever seen in my life. And again, you watch these newer Steven Seagal movies where he doesn't really seem to move around much anymore. But you go back to Above the Law or, again, Marked for Death or some of those early ones. He was fantastic. I loved all of these films. This was a great time period to read about. I really recommend this book. So check it out, The Last Action Heroes. This is a book review to Shogunstein out.